Hello there, friends, and welcome to this episode of SelfKind with me, Erica Webb. Today we are going to talk about comparison and how comparison has a tendency to chew up your joy and spit it right out again. And I think this is a very timely conversation given the fact that we are on the cusp of a new year. So join me for this conversation. So how are you, friend? I am recording this on the 27th of December, 2023. It is going live on the 28th of December, 2023, which means we are in that very strange space between the Christmas period and New Year, and perhaps you have your mind kind of moving into that zone of thinking about what you want in 2024. If you happen to be listening to this a lot later than that, then I feel like these ideas hold true, whether it's just like Thursday tomorrow or a brand new year or anything, right? We don't always have to wait for a new year to make changes at all. But I think that this is a very timely conversation. And like I said, we're going to talk about comparison. Now, I do believe it was Theodore Roosevelt who said comparison is the thief of joy. And this is a really interesting idea because we've talked so many times on this podcast about the reality that our brains judge, right? Our brains judge because it makes it easier to navigate our world. If we know what we like and what we don't like, we know which way to head, right? And so there is a very real reality that to have a human brain means that we will judge, and comparison is a form of judgment. So I'm not sure that it's something that we can completely escape or something that we can completely avoid. But I think when we understand the impact that it has, we can be a little bit more strategic perhaps in how we handle it and what we do with it. The real risk is that we just let comparison take over and lead us to do things that perhaps we don't want to do, or to completely steal our joy, right? So the reason that I'm having this conversation is because I was struck recently by some comparisons that I was making of myself in an environment that felt fairly low stakes, but it felt like a really good example, and how it completely shifted or had the potential to completely shift my experience of something that had felt very joyful towards something that was less joyful had I allowed it. So last week, my family and I went water skiing, which is something that we do every year. We take out our 40-year-old boat and we take our water skis and we go skiing. Now, my husband has been skiing since he was about 11 years old. I've been skiing since I was about 18. And I've never been like a real go-getter on the skis. I've always given it a really good try, but I've never pushed myself very hard. Meanwhile, my husband and my brother-in-law are phenomenal. They are one hand pulling out from the wake, going around the, buoys, practically sideways, practically lying on the water and then going back for another go. And so in comparison, I don't look like I'm doing much, right? But we go into this part of the river that's called the course. And essentially what happens there is you've got a whole bunch of buoys that are set up that float in the water, and they create a course of sorts. And so the boat drives right down the middle between the guide buoys. And then there are these buoys out to the left and the right that the skier then skis around. So you pull out to one side, go around a buoy, pull out to the other side, go around a buoy, and so on and so forth. I think there's 6 that you have to get around. And last year they started to encourage me to go and ski the course with them, which wasn't something that I really thought I wanted to do. Anyway, fast forward, I love it. I love skiing the course because it gives you something to kind of aim for, right? You kind of are not forced, but invited to make these turns at very specific times in order to make it to the next one. And so it created this little challenge for me that has absolutely improved my skiing a lot. And at 40, I didn't think this was going to be the time where I was I feel like I've hit my strongest moment, right? I actually feel like a far better skier at 40 than I ever was in my 20s. And that really surprised me. Anyway, the point of all of this is that I had my husband or someone filmed me while I was skiing the course. Now, while I was skiing, I felt like like a machine. I felt phenomenal. I felt like I was flying. I felt like I was lying sideways, like I see the others do. I felt like I was absolutely hurtling through space. I felt like I was going a million miles an hour, and it felt great. I felt strong. I felt stable. I felt wonderful. I finished my ski, got back in the boat. We went back to the house, and I look at the footage and I'm like, that doesn't look like much. That didn't look anywhere near like what it felt like. And in that moment, I really was like, oh, that's where comparison comes along to chew up and spit out your joy. Because it was there, right? The joy in the experience of that ski was high. Like, I loved it. I felt fantastic. And then when I looked at the footage, I was like, oh, but it wasn't, it doesn't look like what it felt like, or it doesn't look like what I know the good skiers, right? Quote unquote, the good skiers look like. And in that moment where it's like, maybe this isn't what it should be, there is that potential that I, in that moment, lose my joy. Because instead of being with the experience of that felt fantastic, that felt wonderful, it's like, but it wasn't good enough, right? So I sat with that for a little bit because, again, like I said, low stakes. I am not out to become some sort of water skiing champion by any means. It's literally just for fun, something that we do because we enjoy it. And so in that low stakes environment, I was very much able to look at it and go, I find myself feeling like perhaps I should be better, or perhaps people will think differently of me because of the way it looks, and it doesn't quite match up with my experience of how it felt. And so, this idea of comparison stealing our joy, hopefully that's a really useful example for you, but hopefully it also starts to show you some of the other places in your life that you might be comparing. To give you some other examples from my life, I noticed that I do this from a professional point of view. I teach very specific types of things. The movement practices that I offer are very particular types of movement practices. And I am not immune to kind of looking outside of my own square and saying, oh, look at what they're doing. Is that how I should be doing it? Are they doing it better? Blah, 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 blah. And we do this with our friends. We do this everywhere. There's all these places there where we might be looking outside of our own experience and saying, how do I compare? Do I measure up? Am I getting it right? And often we kind of assume that perhaps they're doing it better, or the way that it should be done is what's being demonstrated outside of ourselves. And it can strip us of any joy that we were already experiencing, or the potential for future joy in that thing, because we're so busy looking outside of ourselves for evidence of our worth, right? Rather than looking inside at what our actual experience is like. And that is huge. That is huge. What I want to point out here is the links that comparison has with the way that we should on ourselves. Now, if you have listened to me for any length of time, you will have heard me say before that shoulds are shit. Shoulds are just this thing that when we hear ourselves say it or think it, we should go, what do I need to pay attention to here? Because a should generally points to something that isn't yours, right? An idea, an ideal, a standard that perhaps just isn't yours, right? It hasn't come from you. It hasn't come from a true place of desire, but more of a place of expectations from a society, a culture, a parent, whatever. And so when we recognize that comparison essentially inserts a should into our experience, then we can start to get a little bit curious, right? So in the example of the water skiing, the should that comes up is I should look like my husband when I ski. Now, there's so many reasons why that is problematic. Absolutely. But that is ultimately what's at the heart of it, right? Or that it should look like it felt in order for my experience to be real and worthy, and for it to be like the right match. So there's always going to be, I believe, a should when we are in comparison. Because when we compare, what we're ultimately saying is, I should be able to have an experience like theirs. I should be performing the way that they are. I should want what they want. I should do what they do. And what do we know about shoulds? We know that when we have this idealized expectation of like what we should do and we don't meet that, that is when we experience shame. Ugh, right? So no wonder comparison will strip us of our joy, because we can't experience joy in the midst of shame when they're competing for this sort of same real estate in our mind. Now, that's not to say that they can't coexist. I don't necessarily mean that, because we can be experiencing uncomfortable things and joy simultaneously. We don't need the absence of discomfort to experience joy. However, when we are doing the should thing, I can't subscribe to, I should be able to ski like them, look like them, in order for this to be a valid experience. I can't simultaneously believe that's true and kind of hold on to the experience of my pleasure and joy in my skiing experience for myself at the same time. I don't believe. I can look at it and say, that's really interesting. I think I'm comparing myself, and I'm actually going to choose not to subscribe to that and come back to my experience, right? So it doesn't have to not exist in order for me to experience joy. But I do think that we need to be aware of it so that we can choose the joy rather than allowing that comparison to completely derail us, which is the risk. Because when we haven't got that awareness, I suppose, to do like a bit of a check on, hang on, well, what's driving this? Then the risk is that we just assume that comparison is true. And so much of the time it just simply isn't, right? So I wanted to give you some questions that you can ask when you find yourself in the grips of comparison. And this could be, we talked about like we're on the cusp of a new year. And so perhaps you're starting to think, okay, well, what do I want this new year to look like? What do I want to be doing? What do I want to be experiencing? What do I want to let go of? And there is a very real possibility that if we slip into comparison, we're going to be like, well, what are they doing? What's the right thing to do? What should I be doing? And when we do that, we might end up with goals and ideas and aspirations that simply don't belong to us. And then we can find ourselves chasing these things that we never really wanted, and then not meeting them, and then experiencing the shame that goes along with the gap between I should be able to achieve this and I didn't. So I've got some questions that will hopefully help you to feel into what's going on. So the first question is like just a simple one. Where are you comparing? I think that there are times where instead of recognizing that we're doing a comparison thing, we're just very hyper aware of the fact that we feel deeply uncomfortable. And so the first step might be noticing, I feel really uncomfortable. Am I comparing myself somewhere? Am I comparing myself to something that I believe I should be able to do, to some goal that I believe I should have? And starting to get curious about where might that comparison be being drawn internally. The second part of that is then to ask, well, what am I actually experiencing internally? So to sort of tie this to the example of the water skiing, my actual internal experience in the midst of that activity was that it felt fantastic. It was only afterwards watching the footage that I was like, maybe this isn't good enough. And so kind of noticing, well, what's my experience, right? What do I own? What is my truth around this thing outside of the should and the comparison? Am I experiencing joy and feeling like I shouldn't because, it's not the right kind of joy, or I haven't done a good enough job to justify the joy? Starting to tease out, well, what is my actual experience? And so it might be even comparing trying to think of another example that, takes us off the water skis, but it might even be around, career choice or the type of self-care you want to engage in, and noticing that you feel like you should take up running, even though you don't really like running, and saying, well, where could there be an opportunity here for me to look at my actual experience and to check in, like, do I actually want to run? Even like, is that a truth for me, or am I just feeling like I should and I'm comparing myself to the people who do? Having enough curiosity and being able to hold the judgment off to the side for long enough to be able to get curious about what the truth is for you. And then linked to that is the question of like, well, what do you really want? When I look at that question in the light of the water skiing thing, well, what I really want is just simply to go out and have a good time on water skis. That's all I want. I want to get better purely for my own, I don't know what the right word is, because I'm finding it fun to try, right? I want to improve because I'm enjoying that challenge. But I don't want to be a competitive water skier. I don't want to be better than anyone else. I have literally zero interest in what other people think about me when I ski, other than to get some feedback perhaps to help me improve, to feel like I can do even more. So when you look back and go, well, what is it that I actually want? Then we can start to question the should. Because the should is saying, well, you should be able to do it like this. But it's like, it doesn't even matter. It's just not even part of the equation, because it's completely irrelevant to what is important to me. So questioning, well, what is it that you actually want? And I think that's a tricky question sometimes, because how often have we been asked what we want? How often do we give ourselves permission to ask what we want? I truly believe that's one of the best gifts that we can give ourselves, is to say, hey, like, what do you want? Because in a culture where that hasn't really been something that we've necessarily felt safe to ask, because it's kind of more about like, well, what do other people want? Especially if you've been raised as a female. What do other people want? What do I have to do to keep them happy? Asking what you want might feel a little bit like, am I allowed to do that? Yes, absolutely. So asking the question, what is it that I want? So my tip, I guess, around this, as you consider this in your own life, beyond these questions, is to highlight the importance of acknowledging and noticing the discomfort that sits with comparison, and that sits alongside the underlying should that's driving that comparison. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we ignore the discomfort. It's like we can look at it and be like, oh, I'm feeling uncomfortable because I notice that I feel like I should be able to ski at this level or look like I'm better than I seem to look. And that feels really uncomfortable. That is a very different thing to being like, I shouldn't feel uncomfortable, I'm being ridiculous, I'm perfectly fine, to actually name it and say, you know what, I am comparing to something that is outside of myself, and that makes me uncomfortable. And I acknowledge that there's a should under there that I'm actually not going to subscribe to. I'm not going to subscribe to the idea that I should be better, because this is my experience and I get great joy from that. So I think that can be really helpful, to acknowledge the discomfort and acknowledge the should that sits underneath that comparison. And then also to notice, I don't know if you can hear my kids laughing in the background, they're playing a game together. Notice if the comparison points you towards something that you want. This can be a really interesting one. Oftentimes, I believe that the comparison points more to a should, but there is also a possibility that a comparison might point you towards something that you actually want and desire and would get joy from. And so, yes, comparison can steal your joy, but comparison can also point you in the direction of something that you want and that might bring you joy. I don't know if that happens as often, I'm not sure. But an example of that might be to notice that you are comparing yourself to a friend who works 4 hours a day, not 8, and has a really relaxed lifestyle. And you compare yourself to them and you think, God, I want that, right? Like, oh, how good would that be to be able to work 4 hours a day and just, have a much more relaxed lifestyle. You might compare and be like, it's not so much a should as a want, right? I'm comparing myself, and it's not so much that I think I should have that or should be able to be like that, but it points me to noticing that, oh, I want that. I want that for me. And so that's the other side of this. I don't think it's a two-sided thing. I think there's probably multiple sides to this, and there's another we'll get to in a moment. But consider that too. Is there anywhere where your comparisons are pointing you towards something that you want? And are you giving yourself permission to want what you want? Which is probably a whole other podcast episode, but let's just plant that seed. And then I think it's really important that you come back to your experience. So to bring it again back to that water skiing example, when I came back to my experience, it was like, who gives two hoots what it looked like? It felt amazing. And I'm proud of myself. Full stop. So to come back to your experience and say, you know what, I get that the comparison is pointing towards a should that, is probably exists to help me feel like I belong and serves a purpose. And I'm choosing not to subscribe to that. I'm choosing to say, you know what, I see the should. I see what the comparison is kind of trying to get me to think. And I'm choosing not to do that. I'm choosing to come back to my experience of joy because it's real and it's true and it is not diminished by anyone else and what they're capable of. It's got nothing to do with me and my experience. So I hope those tips are helpful. The other part of this that I do want to talk about before we wrap this episode up is the role of comparison in kind of a different direction. And I think this is coming up a lot at the moment when we consider what's going on around the world. We're just seeing awful, awful things. And the comparison that we can draw in those circumstances, I think, are important. Not because they point us towards shoulds, although, I think we probably all look at it and think, well, we should have a just world. But this idea that we can then also hold space for the both and, right? So in some circumstances, the comparison allows us to sit with the discomfort of very contrasting truths, which can be deeply uncomfortable, right? To know the suffering of other humans who are, just as worthy of love and safety and protection as every single one of us. To hold the suffering of people and simultaneously to go after our own joy can feel very complicated and very difficult. And in that regard, comparison can lead us to feel perhaps guilty and uncertain about our right to going after joy and pleasure and beauty and all of those things. And so I would invite you, if this conversation around comparison kind of brings up those ideas, or if now that I've brought it up, you're like, yeah, I can sort of sense myself doing that comparison. Can you hold space for the both and? We achieve nothing by diminishing our joy in order to kind of try to match the level of suffering that is happening around us, whether that's on a one-to-one sort of personal level or on a more global scale. We can be outraged and hold space for our own joy. And so to be able to hold the idea of the both and through comparison, I think is hugely valuable. So comparison in and of itself is not a beast. It's our awareness of what's the impact of that and how can I use my self-awareness, my curiosity, my self-compassion and my compassion towards others to give myself the space to just sit in it a little bit and to notice what might be under the surface. Because, yeah, it could be the shoulds that really just do us no favors. It could be pointing us in the direction of something that we want or desire. Or it could be pointing us towards unjust practices in our communities or in the world. And so all of those things perhaps ask for a different response, but all of them ask for our awareness and our acknowledgement and our capacity to hold space for two seemingly incompatible truths. What a human thing. So human. So they're my thoughts on comparison. As you head into 2024, I hope that it is a helpful exploration as you consider what it is you want to take into 24, what it is that perhaps you are thinking about letting go of or moving away from, and, thinking about what it is that you actually want, what it is that you actually desire. I will be back next week with more, and it will be a brand new year. I would love to know what's going on for you. I will kind of I will just talk a little bit about 2024 before we wrap up. So I've been doing planning, which is genuinely not my favorite thing. I find planning really hard. It makes me wonder if there's a little bit of a commitment issue under the surface there for me. I'm like, I don't want to put dates to things. I don't love doing that. But I have been planning, and some of the things that are coming up are the brand new round of Soma Home, which will be running in February. I think I'm going to do at least a couple, if not more, in-person workshops in 2024 as well. So they will be in the outer eastern region of Melbourne. Stay tuned for dates, but I think the first one will be in March. And I'll be talking a bit more about the SelfKind Hub as well, which I haven't talked about in a while. But that really is my online home of movement classes specifically, and a lot of somatic exercise. So that's where, if you're interested in moving in ways that help you to feel more ease and more of a sense of home within your body, that's going to be perhaps of interest to you. I'm also going to run my free workshop, Ease, which is an online workshop again, and that will probably be in January actually. So that's probably coming up pretty soon. So if you want to be the first to know about any of those things or all of those things, just be sure that you are subscribed to my email list, because that is where you're kind of guaranteed not to miss anything. I don't always remember to say things on the podcast, and I don't always, the algorithm on social media means that not everybody sees all the things. And so if you want to be sure that you're kind of like getting updated about all the things that are coming up, then my email list is the best place to be. So I will drop a link for that in the show notes so that you're able to do that really easily. But until next week, keep being kind to yourselves. Have a wonderful and safe new year, and I will talk to you again really soon.